The
I
wind
shouldn't be
coming off the
telling you
Willamette
this, but
River did not
I
just
saw
blow.
them together
It
last
battered
night.
the eastern elevation of
They
the
look
Murphy
very
property with the
serious.
rhythmic, punishing force of a physical blow. I stood knee-deep in the freezing mud of the front yard, the rain slicing sideways across my face like shattered glass. My heavy canvas work jacket was entirely soaked through, the weight of the water dragging at my shoulders. I wiped the blinding rain from my eyes with the back of a grease-stained leather glove and stared up at the 2-ton concrete retaining wall. It was the only thing standing between the collapsing hillside and the sunroom of the historic Victorian house. The 3/4-inch steel cabling I had installed 24 hours ago was humming. It was a high, sharp, terrifying vibration that you only hear when the tensile limits of industrial steel are being pushed past 85% of their working load limit. The saturated earth was giving way faster than any geological survey had predicted. If that primary anchor point snapped, thousands of pounds of wet, heavy Oregon clay and shattered concrete would breach the glass. It would take out the load-bearing corner of the foundation, and the house would be structurally condemned before morning. I was the only one left on the site. When the city issued the flash flood evacuation warning 2 hours ago, the rest of my rigging crew had packed their gear and driven out before the access road washed away. I didn't blame them, but I didn't leave. I operate in a world defined by absolute physics. You do not walk away from a rigged load when the tension is live. I turned my back to the wind and waded toward the bed of my heavy-duty utility truck. My boots sank deep into the churning mud, suction fighting my every step. I dropped the tailgate, the metal slick with rain, and hauled out a 70-pound steel come-along winch. The cold bit straight through my wet clothes, turning the joints in my fingers stiff and slow. I needed to establish a secondary deadman anchor to relieve the lateral drift, and I needed to do it in the next 10 minutes. I dragged the heavy winch through the sludge, my breath pluming in white clouds in the beam of my headlamp. I located the reinforced steel ring I had drilled directly into the exposed bedrock on Friday. I locked the winch hook through the eyelet, the heavy steel clasp clicking shut with a solid, definitive sound. I grabbed the ratcheting lever with both hands, planting my boots wide in the mud, and threw my entire body weight backward. The mechanism ground against the tension. The metal groaned in protest. I gave it one more measured, brutal crank until the slack in the line pulled taut. I stood there, rain pouring off the brim of my hard hat, and watched the primary cable. Slowly, the terrifying, high-pitched vibration faded into a dull thrum. The line was stabilized. It was a temporary band-aid on a massive arterial bleed, but it bought me a window of time. I turned back to look at the house. The sprawling Victorian structure was completely dark, save for the erratic, flickering glow of an emergency battery lantern in the front window. The power grid had failed over an hour ago. The access road out of the neighborhood was currently under 3 feet of rushing water. I wasn't going anywhere tonight. The sheer isolation of the property settled over me, a heavy, quiet constraint amidst the roaring storm. I grabbed my heavy tool bag from the truck bed and walked up the front steps. The wooden porch groaned under my weight. I stripped off my soaked canvas jacket and my muddy outer layers, leaving them in a pile by the door. I stood in the entryway in just my gray cotton t-shirt, heavy denim work pants, and my steel-toed boots. The temperature inside the house was dropping rapidly, the old single-pane windows rattling violently in their frames. The air smelled of old cedar, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. I stepped into the archway of the living room, my boots quiet on the hardwood floor. Diana Murphy was standing near the cold stone fireplace. She held a long match, attempting to light a cluster of thick, white pillar candles on the mantel. The sudden flare of yellow light caught the sharp, intelligent angles of her face. She was 35, an architectural restorer who knew the historical bones of this house better than anyone alive, but right now, she just looked worn down to the absolute marrow. She wore a simple white tank top and heavy denim jeans, completely impractical for the freezing temperature creeping into the room, but I knew she hadn't stopped moving since the storm sirens first shrieked. I watched her for a fraction of a second before speaking. Her hands were steady as she lit the wicks, but there was a rigid, brittle tension in the line of her shoulders. She was holding the reality of the situation together by sheer willpower. "The north cable is stabilized," I said, keeping my voice level, pitching it to cut through the ambient noise of the wind outside. Diana startled slightly, dropping the match into an ashtray. She turned to face me, the relief in her eyes immediate but guarded. "You're still here, Dominic. I saw the trucks leave. I thought your crew evacuated." "They did," I stated. I walked further into the room, stopping a respectful distance away from the hearth. I don't leave a secured line unattended when the weather variables change this drastically. It's my contractor's license on the line. It was a factual statement, but it wasn't the entire truth. I had stayed because I had seen the quiet, desperate panic in her eyes when the weather radio announced the road closure, and the thought of leaving her alone in a failing structure hadn't felt like a mathematical option. Footsteps creaked on the staircase behind me. Paris, Diana's younger sister, lingered in the hallway archway. She wore a floral dress layered under a faded denim jacket, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Paris had been pacing the length of the house for 3 hours, jumpy, defensive, and projecting a nervous energy that made the room feel smaller. She tracked my every movement, like I was an unpredictable threat, rather than the rigging specialist trying to keep their foundation from sliding into the river. The news said the bridge is completely washed out, Paris said, her voice tight, bordering on a tremor. We're stuck here. The water is rising. The water isn't the immediate problem, I said calmly, looking at Paris. The lateral shear on the retaining wall is the problem. I'll take the sofa in the study tonight. I need to go back out and check the load tension every 2 hours anyway. Diana stepped away from the fireplace. She crossed the woven rug until she was standing just inches from me. The sudden proximity was jarring. I froze, my muscles locking, my hands going completely still at my sides. She was close enough that the scent of sawdust, old paper, and a faint trace of vanilla reached me over the smell of my own damp clothes. She didn't look at Paris in the background. Instead, she leaned in, her dark hair brushing the shoulder of my t-shirt as she tipped her chin toward my right ear. My stomach plummeted. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the peeling floral wallpaper above the mantel, enforcing a strict, punishing discipline over my own posture. I didn't lean in. I didn't step back. I just became the anchor in the room. The retaining wall didn't fail because of the rain, Diana whispered. Her breath was barely a ghost of sound against my jaw, sharp and urgent. Someone removed the shear pins on the secondary braces yesterday. Paris knows who. Don't mention the deed. The words hit me like a physical weight. I didn't react physically. I didn't turn my head. And I didn't let my expression shift to register the shock. In the periphery of my vision, Paris was still watching us from the doorway. Her eyes were narrowed, her fingers picking nervously at the frayed hem of her denim jacket. The tension in the room was suffocating, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Got it, I murmured back. I pitched my voice incredibly low, ensuring the sound didn't carry past the space between us. I need a heavy-duty flashlight and the original architectural blueprints of the foundation. Diana pulled back slowly. Her expression shifted back to a mask of perfect neutrality. She turned her head toward her sister. Paris, can you go to the kitchen and find the battery-powered weather radio? We need to hear the county updates. Paris hesitated. Her gaze darted suspiciously between Diana and me. She uncrossed her arms, defensive, before turning on her heel and disappearing down the dark corridor toward the back of the house. I looked at Diana. The exhaustion in her eyes had been entirely eclipsed by a quiet, desperate, razor-sharp focus. She was handing me a massive liability. If the wall was intentionally sabotaged, this was no longer just a severe weather emergency. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to condemn the property. I knew the rumors. A corporate developer named Vance had been circling this historic neighborhood for the last 8 months, offering pennies on the dollar to buy out distressed properties. The blueprints are rolled up in the study, Diana said aloud, her voice ringing clear in the quiet room. She walked over to a side table and handed me a heavy, black mag light. Lead the way, I said. The study was located at the front of the house, and it was freezing. The large bay window panes rattled violently against the gale-force wind. Diana moved to the massive oak desk in the center of the room. She didn't speak as she unrolled a large, yellowed sheet of architectural drafting paper over the leather blotter. The edges were curling, stiff with decades of age. I stepped up beside her, keeping a careful, measured 6 inches of distance between my arm and her shoulder. I picked up a pair of heavy brass bookends and pinned the top corners of the paper down. I clicked the heavy switch on the maglight. The sharp, white beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the intricate, faded ink lines of the foundation's original design. Show me the exact points where the shear pins were missing, I instructed. I kept my tone purely professional, focusing entirely on the technical problem in front of us. Diana leaned over the desk. Here, she pointed a slender finger at the lower retaining tier on the diagram. And here, On the north grid. I walked the perimeter on Friday afternoon right after Vance's private inspector left the property. The pins were gone. I didn't realize the implications until the cable started vibrating today. I stared at the structural diagram, the physics locking into a grim picture in my head. If those specific pins were pulled, the entire lateral load of the hillside transferred directly to the top cable when the mud got saturated, I explained, tracing the vector line with my thumb. That's why the vibration was so high earlier. It was mathematically designed to fail during the next heavy storm. They wanted nature to do the dirty work. If the house takes major structural damage to the primary foundation, the city revokes the historical preservation status automatically, Diana explained. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly against the edge of the desk. Paris signed a preliminary intent to sell agreement with Vance behind my back 2 weeks ago. She thought we couldn't afford the property taxes and the upkeep. If the house is condemned, Vance gets the land for commercial zoning, and the agreement forces an immediate sale at land value only. I looked at her trembling hands. The instinct to reach out, to cover her hand with mine and stop the shaking, was a sharp, sudden spike in my chest. I killed the impulse immediately. I pulled a mechanical pencil from my front pocket and marked 3 new vector points on the blueprint. My movements were deliberate, focused on the solution, not the fear. Then we don't let it fail, I said simply. I tapped the pencil against the paper. I need to construct a load-distributing cradle out of timber in your basement. We will brace the interior masonry wall directly against the foundation slab. It's going to take hours of heavy lifting, and I need your help to spot the levels and call the measurements. Diana looked up from the plans. Her eyes locked onto mine in the harsh, reflected light of the flashlight beam. The rigid tension in her shoulders collapsed, and she let out a long, shaky breath. It wasn't a smile, but it was a visible loosening of the terrible, solitary weight she had been carrying alone all day. Tell me what to do, she said. We moved down to the basement. The air down there was drastically colder, smelling intensely of wet earth, old concrete, and impending disaster. The main concrete wall facing the hillside was already weeping muddy water through hairline fractures. Every time a major gust of wind hit the exterior of the house, the floorboards above our heads groaned in protest. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the unfinished space and found a stack of 6x6 oak timbers left over from a previous historical renovation project. These will work, I said. I walked over, grabbed the end of a heavy timber, and hoisted it onto my right shoulder. The rough wood dug into my muscle, the sheer weight of it grounding me in the physical reality of the task. We need to build a triangular brace against the weakest point of the masonry. I'll make the cuts. You run the tape measure. For the next 3 hours, the world narrowed down to a hyper-focused sphere of action. The screech of my battery-powered circular saw echoed off the concrete walls, drowning out the storm outside. Diana called out precise numbers over the noise. We fell into a seamless rhythm. She was meticulous, never second-guessing a measurement, her mind working in perfect tandem with my physical execution. 84¼ inches, she called out, holding the metal tape measure tight against the damp, weeping concrete. I made the cut, the saw blade biting cleanly through the dense oak. I kicked the excess wood aside with my boot and dragged the heavy timber into place, wedging it against the wall. I handed her a heavy steel mallet from my bag. Drive the wooden wedge in at the base, I instructed, pointing to the gap. Hit it square. Don't let it slip. Diana gripped the handle of the mallet. Her knuckles were white. She swung with surprising force. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the basement. She hit it again, and again, driving the wedge tight until the oak timber groaned, taking the immense pressure off the cracking concrete behind it. She dropped the mallet, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. It's holding, I said. I ran my bare hand along the rough masonry. The weeping water had noticeably slowed. The structure was stabilized from the inside. You didn't ask why Paris did it, Diana said quietly. She was standing amidst the sawdust and construction debris, looking at the sturdy wooden brace we had just built together. It doesn't matter right now, I replied. The family politics can wait until the rain stops. She's terrified, Diana murmured, her voice carrying a deep well of sadness. Vance told her the foundation was going to collapse anyway within the year. He told her we would be left bankrupt with nothing but a pile of rubble. He manipulated her fear. Fear makes people careless, I said, zipping the heavy canvas bag shut. He left a paper trail. If Paris signed a preliminary agreement, there has to be a physical copy somewhere in this house. A contract predicated on intentional property, sabotage, is void, and it constitutes extortion. Diana's posture straightened instantly. The sadness vanished, replaced by a sharp, tactical clarity. She keeps a metal lockbox in the back of her closet. Then we find it, I said. We walked back upstairs to the main floor. The temperature in the house had plummeted even further during the hours we spent in the basement. I checked the heavy diver's watch on my wrist. It was 2:15 a.m. The wind was still howling, rattling the windows like teeth in a skull, but the immediate crisis in the basement was handled. Paris was asleep in the floral armchair in the living room. A heavy, quilted blanket pulled all the way up to her chin. The emergency battery radio on the coffee table was hissing a low, steady static. Diana signaled for me to wait in the kitchen while she went upstairs. I stood by the cold, cast-iron stove in the dark kitchen, listening to the rain batter the glass of the back door. My muscles ached from the heavy lifting, a dull, familiar burn spreading across my shoulders and lower back. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, checking the downloaded weather radar. The storm cell was completely stalling over the city, trapped by the mountains. We had at least 12 more hours of this punishing weather. 10 minutes later, Diana returned. Her footsteps were completely silent on the hardwood. She placed a thick, blue accordion folder on the kitchen island. She didn't even lock the box, Diana whispered, shaking her head in a mixture of disbelief and frustration. She opened the folder, pulling out a sheaf of legal documents stapled together at the corner. I leaned over the kitchen island, bringing the beam of the flashlight down to read the dense, bureaucratic paragraphs of the contract. "Look at this specific clause," Diana said, pointing a finger at the bottom of the third page. Her voice was sharp with sudden, terrible clarity. In the event of structural condemnation by the city prior to the 15th of the month, the purchase price defaults to land value only, voiding all historical premiums. Vance dated this last week. He planned the sabotage perfectly to align with this specific storm front. "It proves motive," I agreed, tapping the thick paper. "But we need proof he was the one who ordered the shear pins removed." Suddenly, a loud, violent, metallic snap echoed from the front yard. It was followed instantly by the terrifying, deep bass rumble of shifting earth. I was moving before the sound fully registered in my brain. I grabbed the mag light off the counter and sprinted for the front door, throwing it open and stepping out onto the porch. The wind nearly knocked me backward, stealing the breath from my lungs. I swept the powerful beam of light toward the retaining wall in the darkness. The secondary cable had snapped. The steel rope was whipping wildly in the wind, having taken out a large section of the wooden picket fence when it recoiled. The hillside was actively slumping forward in a wave of dark mud, pushing its massive weight against the primary brace. "Dominic!" Diana yelled. She was standing in the open doorway, the wind tearing violently at her hair, her eyes wide with shock. "Stay inside," I barked over the deafening roar of the storm. I vaulted over the wooden porch railing, landing hard in the ankle-deep mud of the yard. The situation had just gone critical. The triangular brace we built in the basement would hold the interior wall, but if the exterior retaining structure failed completely right now, the mudslide would bury the porch, shatter the front windows, and flood the ground floor with debris. I sprinted toward my utility truck, sliding in the slick mud. I ripped open the side compartment and grabbed a heavy-duty snatch block and a massive spool of half-inch synthetic winch line. The rain was blinding, stinging my eyes. I fought my way up the slick, shifting slope of the yard, sliding backward half a foot with every step I took forward. I had to create a redirected pulley system to anchor the failing concrete wall to the massive, 100-year-old oak tree standing in the center of the front yard. My hands were completely numb as I threaded the thick synthetic line through the steel wheel of the snatch block. I secured it to the remaining steel ring on the retaining wall with a rated shackle, twisting the pin closed until it locked. I grabbed the other end of the line and dragged it through the mud toward the oak tree, my boots sinking deep into the sludge. Diana was suddenly standing beside me in the downpour. She had thrown on a bright yellow vinyl rain slicker, her bare hands grabbing the heavy synthetic rope to help me pull it around the massive, rough bark of the trunk. "I told you to stay inside the house," I shouted, my voice raw as I fought the stiff rope, securing a massive bowline knot with freezing, unresponsive fingers. "It's my house," she yelled back over the wind, her jaw set with an absolute, unyielding stubbornness. I didn't argue. I needed her physical weight. "Pull the slack on 3. 1, 2, 3. Pull, I commanded. We hauled on the wet rope together, our boots dug deep into the sliding mud, fighting the immense, terrifying gravity of the moving earth. The rope tightened, singing with a high-pitched tension. I quickly locked it off with a heavy-duty mechanical load binder, ratcheting the steel handle down with all my strength until the mechanism clicked aggressively into place. The retaining wall shuddered violently, groaned, and then held fast, anchored securely to the deep, unmovable roots of the oak tree. I dropped the ratchet handle into the mud, pulling in sharp breaths, my chest heaving against the cold. Diana was shivering violently next to me, her jeans soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. Without thinking, I took a step forward, placing myself directly between her and the driving wind, using my broader body to block the worst of the freezing rain. I didn't touch her. I just stood there, creating a small, quiet pocket of shelter in the middle of the chaos. "It's secure," I told her, my voice carrying over the wind, steady and certain. "Let's get inside before you freeze." Back in the kitchen, we were both dripping muddy puddles onto the cracked linoleum floor. Paris had woken up from the noise and was standing near the doorway. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic as she took in the mud covering us and the sheer exhaustion etched onto our faces. "Did it fall?" Paris asked, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. "No," Diana said. Her tone was suddenly forged from cold steel. She walked over to the kitchen island, ignoring the mud dripping from her coat, and picked up the blue folder. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just placed the legal contract down on the table, directly in front of her sister. Vance pulled the shear pins. "Paris," Diana said, stripping the wet yellow rain slicker off her shoulders and letting it drop to the floor. "He used your signature on this document to justify bringing a private inspector onto the site, and he sabotaged the wall. If Dominic hadn't been here tonight, you would have traded our family's entire legacy for a condemned plot of dirt." Paris stared down at the papers, all the color draining instantly from her face. "He said, he told me the foundation was already failing. He said it was a mercy buyout before the city hit us with thousands in fines we couldn't pay." "He lied to you," I interjected quietly, standing by the stainless steel sink. "I inspected the concrete myself before I set the initial rig on Friday. The foundation is solid. The only threat to this house was manufactured by him." Paris covered her mouth with both hands, a choked, broken sob escaping her throat. "I'm so sorry. I just wanted us to be safe from the debt. I didn't know what to do. I'll call him in the morning. I'll tell him the deal is off." "You won't call him," Diana instructed, asserting complete, unshakable control over the room. "We will let him show up for the city inspection on Monday morning. We will let him see that the wall held, and then we will hand these documents directly to the city engineer." Paris nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, and retreated silently back upstairs to her room. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. I found a clean, dry dish towel in a drawer and tossed it across the room to Diana. She caught it, pressing the fabric to her face and drying her hair. The adrenaline of the crisis was rapidly fading, leaving behind a heavy, profound exhaustion in its wake. "You should go upstairs and get out of those wet clothes," I told her, keeping my distance near the sink. "I'm going to stay down here and calculate the tension limits on that oak tree. I need to know exactly how much more rain the soil can take before the root system gives." Diana paused, the towel gripped tightly in her hands. She looked at me, really looked at me, taking in the mud smeared across my t-shirt, the grease ground into my hands, and the steady, unmoving reality of my presence in her kitchen at 3 in the morning. "You're freezing, Dominic," she said softly. "I've worked in worse conditions," I replied truthfully. "I'll be fine. Go get warm." She didn't argue. She turned and walked upstairs. 10 minutes later, she came back down, carrying a heavy, oversized woolen fisherman's sweater and a pair of dry gray sweatpants that clearly belonged to an ex or a father. "Change into these," she ordered, setting the folded clothes on a wooden stool. She turned around and placed a steaming mug of black tea on the counter. "Thank you," I said. I took the clothes and changed in the small downstairs half bath. The dry wool was a shock of incredible warmth against my chilled skin. When I came back out, Diana was sitting at the kitchen island. She had wrapped a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders and was staring blankly at the unrolled blueprints. I sat on the stool opposite her, pulling a small, waterproof notepad and a pen from my tool bag. I didn't try to make small talk. I simply started mapping the step-by-step vector calculations, writing down the exact load limits and the necessary permanent repairs we would need to execute once the storm officially passed. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with a shared, quiet survival. She traced the edge of the blueprint. "I've been fighting Vance's lawyers by myself for 8 months," she said quietly. "I didn't think anyone else would stand in the mud for this house." I stopped writing. I put the pen down on the notepad. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes steadily. "Competence isn't about never needing a brace," I said, choosing my words carefully, wanting her to understand the absolute truth of it. "It's about knowing exactly where to place it so the structure doesn't fall." She offered a small, incredibly weary smile. It was the first time I had seen her look somewhat peaceful since the storm sirens first went off yesterday afternoon. I stayed awake at that kitchen island until the pale, gray light of morning finally broke through the heavy cloud cover. I drank the tea she had made me. I finished the calculations. And every time she shifted in her sleep, having rested her head on her folded arms on the counter, I quietly stood up and adjusted the heavy blanket over her shoulders, so the cold draft wouldn't wake her. Monday morning was brilliantly clear, the sky washed clean by the violence of the weekend. The mud in the front yard had begun to dry, hardening like cement around the heavy synthetic line that still tethered the retaining wall to the massive oak tree. Vance arrived exactly at 8 a.m. He stepped out of a sleek, black corporate sedan wearing a pristine, dry trench coat. He was accompanied by a stern-looking city engineer holding an aluminum clipboard. I was standing on the front porch, a cup of hot black coffee in my hand, wearing my work boots and a clean canvas jacket I'd grabbed from the truck. Diana stood right next to me. She was holding the blue folder tightly against her chest. Vance stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. His eyes scanned the rigged cables, the massive timber brace visible through the basement window, and finally, my face. His polite, practiced corporate smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression. "Miss Murphy," Vance said smoothly, projecting false concern. "I was incredibly worried about the property after the severity of the storm. I brought the city inspector to assess the damage for the preliminary condemnation report so we can finalize our agreement." Diana didn't blink. She walked slowly down the wooden steps, her posture perfect, and handed the blue folder directly to the city inspector, bypassing Vance entirely. "You won't find any structural damage, Inspector," Diana said, her voice carrying clear, calm, and authoritative over the morning air. "The foundation is perfectly secure. However, you will find documented proof in that folder of a predatory contract, alongside dated photographs of the missing shear pins from the retaining wall." Vance's face went completely still. The color drained from his cheeks. "This is absurd." "My contractor," Diana continued, gesturing slightly backward toward me, "has thoroughly documented the timeline of the sabotage. He has also filed a formal report with the engineering board this morning regarding the unauthorized removal of critical safety hardware from a load-bearing structure." The inspector opened the folder, reviewing the contract and my technical report with narrowed eyes. He looked at Vance, his expression hardening into professional disgust. "Mr. Vance, I highly suggest you step off this property immediately. We will be conducting a full, formal review of your development practices in this district." Vance opened his mouth to argue, looked at the undeniable physical reality of the rigged cables and the signed paperwork in the inspector's hands, and closed it. He turned on his heel and walked back to his car in complete silence. The inspector thanked Diana, promising a follow-up call, and drove off to file the paperwork at the county office. The yard was suddenly very quiet. The threat was entirely gone. The leverage Vance held was broken permanently. Diana turned to face me. The bright morning sun caught the deep exhaustion and the profound, overwhelming relief in her eyes. "He's gone," she said, almost like she couldn't fully believe the words. "He's gone." I confirmed, my voice steady. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass shear pin, a replacement I had picked up from the industrial supply yard at dawn. I held it out to her in the palm of my hand. "For the permanent repair. We'll set the new concrete anchors tomorrow morning." Diana looked at the brass pin resting in my palm. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between us on the porch steps. "We," she repeated, the word hanging heavy and important in the quiet air. "If you want the contract," I said steadily, keeping my voice low and completely honest, "I don't walk away from a job until the foundation is entirely solid." Diana reached out, Her slender fingers brushed against my rough palm as she picked up the brass pin. Her touch was grounding, a sudden, undeniable anchor of warmth in the cool morning air. "I want the contract," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute quiet certainty. She stepped to my side, turning to look out at the house and the yard, her shoulder pressing firmly against my arm in the bright, public light of day. I didn't step back. I stayed exactly where I was, solid, present, and finally, anchored. Closing thoughts. I learned that true strength isn't about carrying the heaviest load alone. It's about building a shared foundation strong enough to weather any storm together. Real love isn't about drama. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up when the rain starts falling. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. The end.